I think Joy and I are comfortable anytime during the presentation, so don't hold your questions until the end. Please do jump in the chat or just raise your hand or unmute and let us know you have a question. My name, for those of you who I haven't met, is Kevin Unrath. I'm the consultant for library operations for the state of Vermont. Previous to that, I was a library director in a couple libraries here in Vermont and then other places around the United States. And I realized when Joy and I were talking about this presentation this morning that I have supervised employees for my entire career, from grad school internship at the University of Illinois Circulation Desk up until last year when I took this job. So I'm finally off the hook from what I'm guessing you all are still on the hook for. But it's something that I have enjoyed doing, even though I'm currently not in that role. So thank you, Bree. Go Illini. Yes. All right. Joy, do you want to start the sharing the PowerPoint?
Yes, and I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Joy
Please.
Warland. I'm the consultant for continuing education in small and rural libraries. I did not go to the University of Illinois, but my parents did. They met there. So that's my Illinois story here. So
I never knew that. I think the most famous musical alum since your musical was John Philip Sousa. I think he was a pretty famous Illini. So, all right. Can everybody see the PowerPoint okay? It says successful supervising in libraries of all sizes. All right. Very good. Let us know if you have any trouble with that as we're going through. So we've introduced ourselves. And we had mentioned for those who came in a little late that please let us know if you have any questions as we're going along. We're covering a wide range of topics, and we wanted to do that to try to kind of spur conversation. So we're gonna go through what we're covering pretty quick. The focus is that I'm going to talk a little bit more about traditional supervisory situations, larger structures where you have full-time employees, multiple employees, because that's more my background. And Joy is going to talk about smaller but still powerful libraries that may include the supervision of part-time employees and volunteers. So that's really kind of how we're dividing up based on our expertise, what we're presenting. And we'll be intermingling those concepts as we go through the presentation. So I'm curious, just by show of chat, if you all have the ability to chat, how many of you have 4 or more employees at your library? Or just the number of part-time, full-time, and volunteers that you have at your library, maybe. So Rob has 4 or more. But what's the number? What's the breakdown, if you want to put that in the chat? Oh, 19. That's a good number, Amanda. You may be the winner today.
that's more than we have in our department.
13, okay. 1 full-time, 1 part, lots of volunteers. Yep, that is 2. So yes. So this is really showing the range of Vermont right now. 6 kind of in the middle, Rob. Mm-hmm. All right. I'll keep looking at those as we're going through the presentation. But we pretty much any library that you're working in, regardless of the size, you're going to have at least, most likely, a volunteer in Vermont. We have some of the smallest libraries in the United States, but still there's typically some sort of supervision that's going on in that relationship. And if you have, 13 staff and volunteers, if you have 19 staff, you're going to be looking at more of the larger library situation. At McCullough, 6, so 2 full-time, 3 part-time, and 1 split. Oh, yes, that's a fun thing in Vermont, too. There are a lot of librarians who split between schools and public libraries out of necessity sometimes, and sometimes out of preference. So why don't we go ahead and start looking at the learning objectives for today. So we're going to look at job descriptions and how best to formulate those. We're going to look at scheduling and some tips for scheduling. We're going to talk about communications, both with staff and then also specifically with volunteers. We're going to look at a little bit related to regulations, law, statutes, about supervision and HR work. And also, we're going to talk about conflict, motivation, and delegation. So those are the general topics related to supervision that we're looking at. And again, if any questions as we're going along, please hop in and let us know. And we'd love to hear your tips as well. I know a lot of you are seasoned supervisors too. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide? The first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is scheduling. And I want to talk about the concept of budgeting hours. So I'm curious if anybody here, and feel free to raise your hand if you've done this. Does anybody here look at their overall number of hours that you have based on your annual budget? That's the general concept that we're getting at here. All right, Bree, thank you. And I don't want to put you on the spot. You don't have to answer this, but I'm curious, why is that a useful thing to do for you? Or why is that something that you like to do?
Well, I mean, we have set schedules, but we also have, I mean, and I'm a small library, so maybe in the sense it's easier because I'm just scheduling myself and like one other person. But when we have events or want to, the town wants us to participate in things, it's nice to associate a cost with those in a sense. So it's not just free that we're attending. You have to think about staff time and wages. So you know, when the library shows up to a place or the trustees say, you should go to this, it's nice to say, okay, you know, but then something else has to give or we have to take it from somewhere else. I also have summer hours for an employee, like a summer employee. And so it's nice to let them know how many hours they'll be working for the summer.
So as you wind down your fiscal year, you sort of are getting a sense of what those hours might be.
Mhm.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you've really nailed it. That's why that's a useful exercise to do, is really to be able to get a sense of during your fiscal year, how much flexibility do you have with that largest item in your budget? Staffing is almost always the largest item in any library's budget. So having that sort of flexibility, I think, is really important. And then I've also seen it useful in terms of advocating for your library's needs. So if you have a sense of exactly how many hours of staff time you have available throughout the year, if your budget is potentially on the chopping block, you can say, well, you know, staffing's our biggest line item. We're going to lose this many hours of service per year. And you'll have that number at the ready if you've done a budgeting of your hours. And on the flip side, if you're asking for an increase in your budget, most likely a lot of that's going to go towards staffing if it's your operating budget. And you could say, this is how many hours we think we can expand based on what our budgeted hours look like. So essentially, an hours budget is all of your positions, full-time, part-time, hourly contractors, and you can include volunteers if you want to, or just kind of what your average weekly volunteer hours are. And then calculating out how much that costs for those employees. So it's a big spreadsheet that gives you the bottom line, what your hours are. I'm going to turn it over to Joy to talk a little bit about part-time scheduling as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add about adding up the hours of volunteers can be a good advocacy tool because if you show your trustees and you know possibly by extension the select board that you need to have volunteers in order to be functioning the number of hours that you are, that can sometimes be used to persuade them that those could be paid positions. Some of those hours could be done, should be done even by paid employees. So just a little bit about part-time employees and scheduling part-time employees. I feel like one of the best things you can do, one of the few perks you can really give to a part-time employee, they're probably not getting paid very well. They probably either don't have benefits or at all, or they're prorated and may not be that meaningful. But you can have a good schedule is something that makes a part-time job really appealing to some people, especially if they have another career that they're doing, or for whatever reasons they have family obligations, they want to be part-time. So as much as you can, as long as it's not making more work for you or affecting the organization and the health of the organization and the getting the things done that you need, if you can be somewhat flexible with that, accommodate their needs if they need to meet the school bus at the end of the day, a school day or something like that, do that as much as you can. If they can flex their time, sometimes that's going to be helpful for them. Keep in mind that it can be hard to retain part-time employees, and it's hard to find new ones. So if you have somebody that is doing a great job, this is just one of the things that you can do to keep them and to make the things running smoothly, so you don't have high turnover. And then another thing to keep in mind with the part-time employees, and especially in the small libraries, just remember to, if at all possible, to schedule 2 people at the same time, so you're not alone in your library. I know that sometimes it isn't possible, but that really is a safety issue. So if you can make that work, do try to do that as much as possible.
Thank you, Joy. I'm going to talk a little bit now about online scheduling. I'll do another show of hands here and just ask, how many of you out there keep and there's no judgment here, how many of you out there keep a paper schedule that you use to schedule your library? And how many do an online schedule? Okay, thank you, Sherry. Paper calendar. Katie, a paper calendar. A Google Calendar. Transferring to both. Okay, this is great. I'm getting a sense. Okay, so we have some Google Calendar adoptees, which is actually my preferred method. Schedule by hand and put it in a spreadsheet. Very good. All right. I think that a scheduling tool that works for you is the way to go. So the reason I say that is I'm encouraging exploring online tools because then staff can access that schedule really from anywhere, which is the advantage. But if a paper calendar is working well for you, go with it. I actually always used a paper calendar for my desk schedule that I would also encourage you to have in place, especially if you have those 4 or more employees. Having a schedule of who's going to be at the desk at what time can be a useful thing to have in place. But your weekly schedule for when people are going to be in the building, you can stick with a paper schedule. I'm just going to ask anybody who's doing an online schedule now, why is that something that you find useful or something that you find helpful to do? Feel free to unmute and just jump in.
I find the Google Calendar really useful because I can create separate calendars for each of the rooms that are in the building so that I can have events listed out in terms of what's happening when. I've got separate calendars for each of the employees, but then I also have a help desk calendar so that if somebody's in the building, maybe they're working on something else, but I know who's at the desk based on that particular calendar color. So I just find it really easy to track multiple calendars and see the overlays of who's doing what at what time.
Thank you for mentioning the color coding page. I appreciate that because that can be so useful. If you have a number of employees, you can schedule them and use a different color for who they are, which makes it really easy to see where you are on the schedule. Jenny pointed out you can change that schedule in real time. And the idea of having multiple calendars as well So you can schedule your rooms out. That's something that we actually use in my household. So I have my personal schedule, and then we have the schedule of the kids' activities, and then we have the work schedule, and they're all color coded in Google. So I know if it's like a lavender color, that's a kid's thing that's come up. But it also can be used to good effect in the library as well. So my main advice for scheduling is consider, you can use Microsoft Outlook if that's a program that you use. I put a link to one of the popular free online scheduling software suites, Homebase. They do have a free version. The nice thing with that is it has an app, so you can go in and look at the schedule on an app on the phone. Although Google Calendar has an app as well. So something to consider exploring if you're running into situations where you are wondering who's on schedule during a winter weather emergency, or if someone calls out sick or things like that. But on the other hand, the power does go out sometimes too. So, not online is not always 100% reliable. Should we move on to any other scheduling related things? I just wanted to cover that real quick and talk about it.
Well, I inherited, just when I stepped in October, it's all paper. It's the calendar that's at the in the staff room, and I want to have both. And I think if I do transfer to both, I think I would be the only one looking at it, even though I will share it with them. So, but because I don't know if I'm home, I don't know who, I have an idea of who's working, but on a Saturday, I don't. Because Saturday is the day where people sign up. It's not a consistent Saturday for us. But
so you're in the
paper,
midst of transitioning, and that
well, and the
Saturday is
staff
the key
likes the book. They like the paper book. They've been doing it for so long. So for me to just be like, all right, we got something new. That's something we'll talk about. But yeah.
I think that's a reasonable thing. To continuity, there's a meaningful it's meaningful to think about what your staff wants and what they're comfortable with.
I think that just one caution about doing it in more than one place is just to keep both updated so that they're consistent with each other. But I also think that's a great point you made, Rob, that the online ones you can see when you're working remotely, or even if you're not working, but as the director, you might want to know who's there. So that's really an advantage.
It changes often with, people erase things or change their time, or they leave at 1. And and I do have a couple of staff that don't use computers when they're home, so they wouldn't even be able to see it when they're home. Or a sub, if a sub's filling in. There's a lot, but I will be moving towards a Google Calendar as well. Like I'll have both. It's
it's interesting. The sort of inflection point we're at now with COVID, I think it made us realize that almost anyone now has the ability to go online and do something. My mother, who is not tech savvy now, can go on and Zoom, and a lot of us learned that skill even though we didn't want to, and can now sort of do that almost seamlessly. In the Vermont legislature now, there's a bill to make hybrid meetings the standard for meetings. It hasn't passed yet, so don't worry, but it could. And they were saying really that sort of online environment is ubiquitous, but that still doesn't mean that people want to do it when they're home. They might not enjoy that and might not want to have to. So that's sort of the change that's happened. And
when you'd want to be sensitive to not have the expectation that they are going to look at the calendar when they're at home and not being, it's not on their paid time. I think that's the tricky thing with, email, even, things online, the temptation to and the expectation that people are always going to be checking in.
Yes, that's a very good point. Just like email. Yep. Bree, thanks for that. You write it down on a paper calendar, which sometimes helps you see it better, and then transfer to an online calendar. And the space and the staff are scheduled that way. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the events I have to do on paper. Like I just have to in my mind. And that's what I use to write and then, yeah, and then I do the staff in the space on the Google Calendar. So, and I missed, Joy, I missed your point because I'm having some computer issues, or, well, Westford's having some computer issues.
Yeah, you went in and out a little bit, but I think
Yeah.
you got what I was just saying, that cautioning about like not having an expectation that people are going to be online doing work things when they're at home. That, you know, sometimes that doing things online creates that expectation, and it's not a good one for the director and supervisor to have of other staff.
So pluses and minuses, convenience, expectations, internet connectivity isn't always there, Westford, whatnot. So let's move on, though, to, just for the sake of time, to communicating with your staff and with your volunteers. And I'm just going to lay out some very general concepts. I bet a lot of you have already been introduced to these, but I want to talk about them as sort of a whole. First of all, I want to talk about modalities of communication. So we all, I think, have a sense, and there are plenty of tests you can take to figure this out, of what your modality of communication is. Are you a visual communicator? So do you prefer to have something described or get a picture of something? Are you an auditory communication? Do you like someone to tell you something? Do you like to listen, have a conversation? Do you like someone to show you something? That's kinesthetic. And then a fairly new one for me, is a cognitive. That would be someone who really wants the information so they can study it and get back to you on it. You're not going to convince them in person of a lot of anything. They're going to want to have a chance to process the information on their own. We all have different modalities of communication, and that's useful, I think, for two reasons. One, we can know how we best work, and two, it's really good to get a sense of the people you're supervising over time, what their preferred modality of communication is, because you can probably reach them easier if you use whatever they best, the way they communicate the best. And so, you can ask that. You can try to get a sense based on the words that they use. So do they say, "I hear you," or "I see what you're saying"? You can over time develop that, but try to have a sense of your staff or your volunteers and how they best communicate. And that's also true of the style of communication. This one I find a little silly because the answer's already in the styles. Everybody should have an assertive mode of communication. Passive isn't good, aggressive isn't good, assertive is what you're supposed to be. Passive aggressive is really not good. But this is more, I think, something to try to achieve. I have found my partners in the business world, and the business world is a lot more aggressive in their communication style. I found libraries tend to be a little more passive overall, people that work in libraries, in their communication style. But we all should strive to be assertive, and that's respecting the rights and the thoughts of others, listening, but also clearly stating what you are trying to communicate. And I think that's especially important as a supervisor. So if you are trying to direct people in the work that they're doing, you need to be clear, but you also need to be kind. And that, I think, is kind of that assertive balance. So just something to think about. And then the last element of communication I think is important is the method through which you communicate. And I don't have a rhyme or reason in my experience with this, but I have found over time that I get better responses from people using different methods. I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if it lines up with their modality of communication, but I found some people, if I text them, I'll get a response right away and they'll prefer that. Others do not want me to ever text them, which is kind of a respecting the time thing. But if I email them, I'll get a good answer. Some folks I do have to talk to in person because they don't want to do written communication. Many people I know hate talking on the phone. I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if that's a library thing. Actually, I know a lot of non-library people who don't want to talk on the phone. I do think that's a generational thing to a certain degree. So preferring texting over talking. So getting a sense, Bree, we'll have to talk sometime. I like talking on the phone too. But I know, so sort of getting a sense of how you can best reach your employees. And also, I think having that self-awareness of how you best communicate to. But really, as a supervisor, you are put in a position where you have to get at least adequate at all of the different ways of communicating. You don't have to really like texting. You don't have to want to show someone how something works, but you're going to be dealing with more people who have different modalities, different styles, different methods than they do to you. You're only one person. They'll figure you out, but you have to figure the whole group of them out. And that
Kevin,
is
I have
one
a
of yeah, fire away.
I have a question for you that I just started thinking about. Like, is it reasonable in your experience to accommodate people in all these I'm thinking about the methods specifically. Like, if someone says, I just don't do email, like, well, reasonable to say, well, you're going to have to do email for work, or sometimes you're going to have to talk on the phone, even if you don't like it. Because I'm imagining if you had, if you're supervising, somebody had 19 people, and you have to remember, like, someone likes to text. I mean, in your own best interest, you're going to want a response sometimes. So you might default to, like, they really won't write back. But I'm just curious what, in all the experience that you've had, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's very reasonable to expect someone to respond regardless of how you communicate with them. But I
I
would
mean,
say,
is it reasonable for them to insist on, like, I'm not going to look at my email, but if you text me, I'll write back?
yeah, so Bree pointed out, good to have that in the job description, which we'll be looking at later. But I think that if someone said, I'm not going to respond to an email, and I actually have had that, now that I think about it, I'm just not good at reading emails, is what and so I think the assertive response to that is, I understand that I'm not very good at reading texts, but sometimes we will communicate that way. I'll make an effort to try to talk to you or try to text you. But can you make an effort to try to, even though it's not your preferred method of communication, to try to read emails when I send them? I think that would be the discussion I'd have. I wouldn't want to say, unless it was an accommodation, and I think that that's an important distinction. So if someone has, say, a learning disability, and they're really so much better at listening, then perhaps a text or an email, especially a long email, might not be the best choice. But otherwise, if it's just really a preference, I think trying to reach a middle ground would be my approach. Oh, yes, Dina, and that's so true. If it's hard to be an employee and get one email, imagine what it's like to get all of the emails that you get from everyone in the community and the library and the town and the Vermont Library Association conference people, which you're dealing with now, I think. So, all right. Any questions? That was a very good question, Joy. Any other questions or any other comments on communicating or tips that you all want to share that you found to be helpful before we move on? All right. Why don't we jump ahead? I think you're up next with talking to we have some questions, and then, excuse me, then you're up. So these are just some questions to think about, and I think these actually go hand in hand with some of those questions we were talking about. So this is kind of a way to inventory the way that you're communicating, and I think these are useful ways to just think about maybe where you have some gaps or what you're doing well, but how do you communicate, and how often do you? Holding a meeting, this is, I think, maybe a personal pet peeve of mine, but if you have a meeting of any substance that's not just an impromptu meeting, try to have an agenda with time limits for it, because you're really doing a disservice to folks who may have those later agenda items if you spend all of the time on the early agenda items. So kind of figuring that out, I think, is really important, and also developing some ground rules for behavior in those meetings. If they get a little out of hand, I think is important. So it's kind of being honest but being civil is generally the ground rules that we would lay out. Dealing with someone who dominates the conversation. I'm curious if anybody has any silver bullets for that.
This doesn't exactly correct that, but or it's not a direct response to it. But I find it really helpful when the person who's leading the meeting will say, "Can we hear from somebody else?" Or is there somebody who hasn't spoken yet? Or even checking in with the person directly and say, "Kevin, you haven't spoken. Do you want to add anything?" Because I think that it's just that redirecting can help, and it also really helps people who are less likely to talk. They might have something to say and be more likely to share if they're directly invited like that.
Yeah, I think that's what I've heard at meetings, is that sort of direct invitation to people who haven't participated, or just being clear, like, we've heard from you a lot, Michael. Um, let's hear from some of the other folks and get the sense of what they think. Just in a polite way, but in an assertive way. Yeah. I found just one other strategy, if you're running into that, is breaking up into small groups. It can be hard to dominate a conversation when you're in a smaller group, and then having someone record and report back. That's a strategy for kind of mixing up. And we use that online as well as in person, and it can be a useful way to change the pace and to get folks thinking in different groups. Because if you have one person dominating a conversation, at least they're only going to be dominating that little group for the rest of the time, and the other groups are going to share too. Um, and then this really goes to the last question as well. How can you ensure that team members are comfortable contributing in meetings? I think setting that expectation that you will listen, that you'll go through the agenda and make sure that you're covering it in the time allotted, and that when someone contributes an idea who tends to hold back, making sure that that idea makes it to the group and that you talk about that to kind of honor their stepping up. And then just one more point before we move forward. Some folks really don't like to have in-person meetings where they're on the spot to talk about things. They might be one of those cognitive thinkers who wants to have a chance to process. And so I think opening an invitation to sharing ideas, either offline via email or later on, is really important, especially when you're doing team brainstorming, because their thought process, they may come up with something great, but not on the spur of the moment. And so just making sure to have that invitation for them to loop back with you is a good practice.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, it's just like ending the meeting by saying, if you think of something later, please be in touch. I just want to add one thing about a part-time um, perspective, and that is, if at all possible, to have staff meetings, even if you have a very small staff, but it's still important to get together with them. And it can be hard to do, because you don't want somebody to have to come in, on their off hours. But if there's a way that you can, it does really make the team feel more like a team. I think if you take just, it doesn't have to be that often, once a month or something, but it does really help to have that time together. I feel like I've been a part-time employee, and for me, it's felt like I was more part of the team if I were included in those meetings. And then along with the part-time thing, the volunteers, so many of our libraries really depend on volunteers, and they really are like staff at some libraries. So you need to meet with them as well. So you're going to have to train them. Your life is going to be better if your volunteers are well trained. I think we've probably all had to clean up mistakes that not well trained volunteers or staff really have done. So make sure that you're training the volunteers regularly, and then also have an appreciation thing at least once a year for them. And there are some tools that you can do to make it easier. Remember that if they are only coming in every so often, it's harder to remember like how to do things, the procedures. It might even be harder for them to remember, like, what am I supposed to be doing here today, if they're not coming in regularly. So you can have a guidebook, and that can have like instructions on what they're supposed to do, step-by-step things. So especially if it's technology kind of things, if they're using the ILS, that's something that they might not use regularly enough to know how to do it. So have steps for that. Have realistic expectations, because again, it's going to make your life easier if your expectations are managed, know what they are good at, know what type of tasks some can do and some might not be able to do. Again, particularly I've run into that with technology. There are some people that are just not that comfortable with it, and it's not going to probably change, and it's just going to be a headache for you if you keep, consistently ask them to do something. And then the one thing that, especially if they are working with the catalog at all, make sure that they are trained really well on patron privacy, because that's not something that people who are not working in libraries think. They don't realize what an important tenet of librarianship that is. So just make sure that if they have access to people's records and people's addresses, and that they are very well trained about that. Another thing that can really help with volunteers is if you can have like a queen or king volunteer, somebody who is like the ringleader of the volunteers. So it's not always you. So if somebody is willing to have their volunteer task be scheduling the volunteers, that can really take a lot off of your plate, so you can do other things. I also think that sometimes we forget to bring volunteers in on like the strategic plan, the mission, the vision of the library, so that everything that they're doing feeds into that the same way staff members know about that. And they see sort of the big picture of why we're doing things and why we're making certain decisions. It really helps if they are aware of that. And it also helps them in their, they're great communicators with the community oftentimes, because they talk to their friends about their volunteer work they're doing at the library. So if they really understand the library, they're going to do that better. And then tell them about VLA, tell them about the friends and trustees listserv and things like that, so that they can also be part of the bigger picture. And then my last point about just volunteers and really any staff, but make sure that they know that they can ask questions anytime, because it's better to have them ask the same question over and over again if they haven't gotten something, some training, if they don't really understand something. And again, it's going to make your life easier if they ask questions instead of, being embarrassed or self-conscious about that and trying to do something when they're not really quite sure how to do it. Okay, back to you, Kevin.
Those are some great points. I would carry them over, I think, to working with friends to a certain degree as well. I think that some of them are kind of a dual, kind of a similar role in a way. Delegation. Boy, if I could delegate having volunteer, I think I did delegate having my volunteers managed by someone else at the library. And that's a good example of delegation. I want to talk about it because it's really, I think, something to consider to try to improve not just your time management and the library's operations, but also really give your staff a opportunity to learn how to do more functions than what's in their core job description. So I think there's a misnomer when it comes to delegation. Delegation is really not just giving assignments to people. And it's not giving assignments to people that are in their work area. What delegation really is taking something that is one of your responsibilities that really you're going to be accountable for and giving that to someone to make the decisions to make that happen. So it's not something that's inherent in their role. It is something that would be in other duties as assigned in the job description. But it's something that you feel like they would be good at, that they could learn about, that they could help you with, and that would free up your time eventually. So, delegation doesn't free up time immediately. It actually takes more time because you're likely going to be training the person on how to perform whatever activity they're performing, because it's really something you know more about initially than they do. But it gives them the opportunity to develop job skills and awareness of something that maybe you'll need a backup on in the future, and will eventually, once it gets to the point where if it's an ongoing task, they are good at it, will free up your time. So the key I found, and one example would be, I think, at my last position, I did actually delegate volunteer responsibilities to staff members, even though that was something that was in my job description. And the keys are to know that the person has enough time to work on the project, or that you're pulling back from another duty that they have, because you can't really have someone just do more work. That's not fair, unless they're, don't have enough on their plate. But seeing where you're going to free up their time in order to delegate them the activity, and then explain really what it is, what the goal is, how long it'll be going on, and how you're going to be checking in. So really thinking of it as a relationship based on a shared goal that you have with a team member or team members. And obviously there are some things that you're not going to delegate. So you have core responsibilities that are part of the bread and butter of the job you do. You don't want to delegate your core responsibilities. You're not going to delegate supervising to someone else, unless you've hired someone, to take that role on and negotiated your job responsibilities. But really, they're projects that either have are ancillary to what you're doing, are kind of in between what you and another person are doing, or they're projects that are time delimited that you feel like someone would be effective at. You don't want to delegate crisis situations. That's really, the buck stops here. You don't want to put someone in a position to have to deal with a crisis because you don't have the time or you don't want to. I mean, I don't want to have to talk to the press about the fact my brand new library just flooded and we're closed for 2 days, but I'm not going to delegate that to someone. I'm going to leave my son's football game and drive to the library and make sure the fire department pumps out the elevator. And then I'm going to talk to the local reporter about it, like I did a couple years ago with the Pearson. I'm not going to call up my staff member who lives there and say, can you go check on this flooding thing at our brand new library? I'm busy at the moment.
What are you trying to say?
Nothing, Rob. And nothing at all. Or obviously anything that requires confidentiality. You're not going to want to, put someone in that area where they may be privy to information with their peer group, or really that you should, be have as few eyes as possible on. So things like, disciplinary matters, or contract negotiations is another example where you might have a requirement that something be kept as confidential as possible.
And I think also
Joy?
health matters. Sometimes because you're their supervisor, you might have personal information about them that only you should have. I just want to add a couple things. One, and I say this out of personal experience, that be wary of slipping into like, oh, it's easier if I just do it myself, because you end up, you have to put the time in training at the front end, and it takes some time at that point. But if you end up just thinking, oh, it's just quicker if I just do it, that can just, it's not a good use of your other staff and volunteers. Although, in the short run, that might be tempting. And then I also just want to add, I don't know if anyone in here works at a library that has union employees, but you have to be, make sure that you're not doing something that is not in their job, asking them to do something that's not in their job description, and that they aren't paid at a level, of that a certain level of responsibility. And just if it is a union shop, that can get very complicated very quickly, because they can file a grievance, and you want to avoid that.
Yeah, and just to tack onto that too, there's also regulations and sometimes union rules about having a volunteer do a job that a union position is already doing. So kind of a opposite wrinkle on there, but similar in terms of delegating or not delegating. So any questions or thoughts on delegation? success stories? We can keep going, but do feel free to jump in or jump in the chat as we move along. I want to talk a little bit about team building and motivation. I think that this is something that supervisors should spend a lot more time thinking about. Really, we spend a lot of time thinking about the challenges and the crises and the difficult situations and conflict, and we'll deal with that. But I think that moving your operation from doing well to doing great is really a matter of focusing on motivation and on team building. So that's how you take your library and you really move it to that next level of providing wonderful service. It's really the positive side of supervision. I'm sure I won't spend time on it, that you all are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think it's still a great model for thinking about how people are motivated. So people begin to be motivated by what their basic needs are. Getting a paycheck allows people to have food and shelter and warmth and be able to exist. Then we move on to psychological needs, which include things like relationships with other people, friendships, feeling of accomplishment, and then finally that self-actualizing or self-fulfillment needs. So achieving your potential, being creative and problem solving. And I find it an interesting continuum because I think it explains why not just employees, but also volunteers or people who maybe are even overqualified to work in your library will still come and work. I had a wonderful employee who had a master's degree in an affiliated field and decades of experience and didn't really need to have the part-time job that this employee had, but really I think was motivated by that desire to have relationships and friendships and a feeling of accomplishment. And I think most, all volunteers by definition, correct me if I'm wrong, Joey, but they're not getting any money from it. So unless they don't have a warm place to stay and they're coming to your library for that, they're really looking for those other higher levels of motivation when they come in. So that I think it's a useful framework to consider. And within the context of motivation, figuring out ways that are small or large to celebrate the successes of what your employees are doing. And that can be anything from continuing to serve when your library gets busier in the same fashion, or noticing a particularly good interaction that someone's had. I think when someone's a new employee, it's especially important or a new volunteer to recognize that they've learned the basic tasks of their position. That's part of onboarding too, but just, complimenting someone on their success. Some strategies that I use when I really think someone's done a good job are to email the employee and also copy my board chair so that it's recognizing someone publicly for a particularly, good work that they've done. I think that that's a good technique. Having some kind of, just like Joy, you mentioned a volunteer recognition event. I think staff retreats or staff days to recognize the work of your staff are also really good practices when it comes to motivation and to celebrating. And staff days, I've been to retreats where we've done mostly planning, and I've been to retreats where we've done celebrating. And I've found that I actually like a combination of the two because when I've had employees, I have some that really love to celebrate and love to get together, and they have friendships at work and they enjoy that. And I have some staff who really want to do work when they're at work. And so if I'm, paying them to come to a staff retreat, they want to have some time to actually move forward and do some planning as well. And they don't really want to do the socializing thing as much at work, and that's fine. But I found that that's a good balance. Sherry, your board hosts a volunteer set. That's a great way to really bring those three groups together. That's awesome, and possibly the friends as well, just to so the board has a chance. And I think a lot of board members don't really have as much awareness of who some of the volunteers or the part-time staff are. So that gives them a chance to kind of meet them and recognize them as well. Joy, did you want to jump in with motivation related?
No, I don't think, I mean, I think
Okay.
you covered things really well. I just, one thing about the staff retreats and the, you know, again, it has to go, it's similar to the styles that people have, like, you know, it's hard to do one thing that's going to maybe like be enjoyable to everybody. So, you know, try to mix
Mhm.
it up a little bit, and, you know, don't always have it be like, you know, we're going to have bowling day or whatever. Because some people are just not going to want to do that. So,
Yeah, so sort of some other ideas that are in there. Bowling day is an option if people like, or you know, taking a field trip together as a team. Having a, you know, we've done a movie day where we've done a, you know, a staff movie and lunch. You can offer someone the chance to take a class or take a class together. You can work on something that's a problem solving activity. And I don't mean problem solving in terms of like solve the library's problems. I mean more like a trivia game or your library escape room or something like that. But there, you know, I think the idea of mixing it up so people have fun, know they're going to have fun at least some of the time, even if they're not a bowler or a trivia person, is a good way to go. And also, I think if you can personalize and get to know your team members, as Bree pointed out, you'll have a better chance of celebrating the work or the volunteering that they're doing in a way that's meaningful to them. So just generally getting to know folks is a great aid over time.
yeah, but I really like that idea of that you copied your board chair, because I feel like sometimes librarians are really getting a lot of great work done, but they're sort of quietly doing it, and like the library's chugging along really well, and maybe the board just thinks it's easy to have that happen, or they think that, you know, the director's doing everything. So to, yeah, that
Mhm.
acknowledgement, the public acknowledgement, and to other you know, team members as well. It's nice. We have a thing in our staff meetings where Tom and Jeanette will do an update on whatever all the people in their division are doing, and then, you know, it's a great way for us to hear what people that we don't work that closely with, and, you know, especially if something, there's been like a big success or something that, you know, there's this public recognition of it in our meetings, which I think is really creates a positive environment.
And building on that too, Jane Kearns, I don't know if she started this practice, but she has one of her employees every month come to her board meetings in Williston. And so they sort of rotate through, but at least one gets to talk about what they've done for the year and also gets to kind of meet the board members and whatnot. And I think that's a good practice. It could be a, you know, a little bit stressful, but I think overall it's positive because they get to brag about what they've done. So
So a little bit more of the part-time perspective. That was actually one of the things on my notes for that, is to bring a part-time person to a board meeting so that they feel like part of the team, and that the board recognizes that they're doing really good work. So again, you know, a part-time position, probably, at least in Vermont, doesn't pay that well. They it might be one of the it might be one of 2 or 3 jobs that they have. So what do you do if, like, if you really want to make it a great job for them, you really want them to stay? Give them meaningful work. Again, if they're really engaged and know about the strategic plan and the mission and the values of the library, that's going to make their job feel more important to them. It's so they're not doing it just for the small amount of money that they're getting. Giving them some autonomy. I mean, there's a lot of people in Vermont who have multiple jobs. It's because one of them is like in the arts, or they're run a nonprofit, which also doesn't make very much money. But so they're putting these things together, and if they have some autonomy and creativity that they're able to bring to their part-time library job, they're probably going to like it better, and they're going to do a better job. And I already mentioned the schedule. You know, if as much as you can, give them a good schedule. Also, inviting them to do professional development, even though they're part-time. You know, tell them about the VLA conference, and pay for them to join that, or tell them about the certificate of public librarianship program, see if they want to engage with that, or just coming to the occasional webinar that we're doing or somebody else is doing, that really makes them more invested. And also you're treating them like a professional. Just because they aren't there full time doesn't mean that they aren't a professional and valued employee. And along with that, they might bring a skill set and a knowledge set that you don't have. So like check in with them, ask for their input about policies. If they're working with the public, and they might have more sort of on the floor experience than you do. If you're more administrative and not working so closely with patrons, and then talk to them, like when you have reviews, like what are their goals, why are they in this job, what do they like most about it, what are the challenges, and what makes them stay. And then if you can value what they're doing outside of the library as well. So an example from my own life is that I'm also a freelance musician as well as being a librarian. And it was very helpful to me that when I did have a part-time job, the trustees understood that that was a really important part of my life, and that they accommodated within reason, that when I went to do that, because it helped me stay in that job longer, because I was able to make more money doing that, and also just was being fulfilled in that way. So those are just ways that that you can empower a part-time employee and make them feel part of the team. And again, it's in your best interest, if they're a really good employee, to keep them around. So you want to pay attention to that. And I think volunteers, again, I talked about this a little bit already, but give them work that they're good at, because they're there partly to have fun. So if they don't make them do something they really don't want to do, give them consistent tasks so that they can thrive in that. Value their knowledge too. They might be people who've lived in the community for a very long time. They might know way more about it than you do, especially if you don't live in the town that you work in, which is often the case. And again, just show appreciation. There's Friends of the Library Week for the Friends group. And don't forget that trustees and friends are also a type of volunteer. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but some of this applies to those people in those positions as well.
We're sort of running out of time, Joy, and I don't want to
We
keep
are.
people too long over. Would it be okay if we skipped this slide? And we will send the slides out afterwards, but why don't we skip this? And why don't we, I actually want to jump ahead to 15, because otherwise I think we're going to take up, so maybe, yes, I wanted to jump here. I think this is worth the price of admission, which was $0. So, but there's a couple links to employment posters that once we send this your way, I would recommend taking a look at. You can get all of the employment posters for both the state of Vermont and the federal government related to those regulations around things like minimum wage, required benefits. If you have a part-time employee who works an average of 18 hours a week or more, then you are required to give them 40 hours of sick leave in Vermont, for example. And there's a poster about that. That's a mandatory leave. Discrimination, accessibility, ADA, all of these are important things for you to know as a supervisor, whether it's part of the hiring process or whether it's part of the supervision process. And I found the easiest way to stay up to date on them are actually to follow these links to both the state of Vermont and to the Department of Labor's employment posters. You also are required to print them out and have them available for your staff to view. So you can do that here for free, and don't buy the poster that someone wants to sell you for $35 that's laminated. That's a quick recommendation. When we send this out, those links will be there. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry we've run over time. We appreciate your coming, Paige, and others. And I just wanted to throw it back over there. Joy has also created a list of links that might be useful to you that we'll send your way as well in terms of resources for supervising. Oh, where do you have to post them? You're supposed to post them in a place that all employees can see. So if you have a break room, which I don't think you do, Bree, that's a place they're posted a lot of times. If you have a closet where employees access janitorial supplies or something else, that's another place that you can post them. It just has to be a place that you're not trying to kind of hide them away so the employee won't see them. You're supposed to post them at a place that employees would have a chance to look at them because there's yeah okay. But one thing you can do is print them all out and put them in one binder and put that on the wall. The vestibule, that works. Yep. But someplace that they are easily accessible to employees, but you don't want them out in the public because there's a lot of them. However you can make that happen.
So we will send out the slides. There are this a slide that's up now. Those are all links, and there are examples of things that we didn't actually get to talk about job descriptions and evaluations, but there are some examples in this resource page. And again, I'll post the slides and with the recording. So Jenny asks, will a digital file work?
Yeah, so they are required to be printed, but that is only true if you are a physical operation. So if you're a virtual company, obviously you can do them digitally. But if you have a physical presence, they are required. It's my understanding they're required to be printed and posted on the wall in the similar way that the state of Vermont requires agendas to be printed and posted. So
do we want to just wrap up? We did skip some pretty major things that we were going to talk about, but next time we'll do a 90-minute webinar, and it's been great that this has been quite interactive. So does anybody have any last minute questions or comments, great successes you've had in supervising or challenges?
So Joy and I decided to do this course because a lot of the basic public library administration topics we found we were giving short shrift to. So this is the first of several that we're planning to do. We're going to have one on buildings, facilities. We're going to have one related to communications and marketing. And so stay tuned for sort of additional topics in library administration as the umbrella for this series that we're doing. But thanks so much for coming. I appreciate
thanks everybody.
The input and getting to see my colleagues too.
And along the lines of like the future webinars we're going to do, if you have topics, please, at any time, please send them, but particularly around this kind of thing, because we do know that, like, like the early slide said, so, now you're a supervisor. This is like being in those leadership roles are things that sometimes people kind of unexpectedly get into. So, please let us know if there's specific things that you want us to cover. And thank you again.
Oh, Paige, did you have a question before we signed off?